Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, May 27th, 1939, a boat carrying 937 Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution in Germany was turned away from Havana, Cuba. Only 28 immigrants were allowed off of the ship, and then a series of appeals and attempts to find a home for these refugees ensued. Appeals to let the ship come to the United States and Canada were denied. Eventually, the ship was forced to sail back to Europe. The passengers of the ship returned to Europe, spread out across the continent. In the coming years, 254 people who were on the SS St. Louis died in the Holocaust. Here to discuss the trip of the SS St. Louis, which has come to be known as the Voyage of the Damned, are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Kellie, can we start actually with just sort of, what's your big picture sort of thought about what this story means, and then we'll get into some of the details.
I mean, I think I'm really glad we're covering this story because I feel like so much of this history gets swept under the rug, especially when we teach, the history of World War II. America is the great savior, the hero that comes in and literally saves the day. And we don't want to talk about this dark history in which we turned away people who sought our assistance, who sought our help and our ability for our country to be a haven to people who were fleeing war. And, there's a lot about this story that's just devastating, to say the least. And it has to be discussed.
Yeah.
It cuts so sharply against a core American mythos, right? That the United States is the refuge of the world, that this is where people who have nowhere else to go come. And that hadn't been true of the United States for a while, but particularly in this moment when desperate people are trying to find a safe haven, that the United States looks at them and says, no, thank you, is a really, really important story.
Right. There's sort of two core mythos that are wrapped up here, which is one is the U.S. as the savior in World War II, and then the other is, you were saying, the U.S. as a haven, and both of those get undercut. Here, we've done plenty of episodes, I think, that show that those are often myths, right? There's exclusion acts, there's all sorts of, there's a long history of us not being those things. That said, so let's go to some of the details of this trip, and maybe let's talk about the trip as a trip, as a set of passengers who... This is about 6 months after Kristallnacht, as Nazi Germany is really becoming a true force of terror. There's just a few details about the trip itself and the group of immigrants on the ship. For one, correct me if I'm wrong here, but this is a German boat, but it makes accommodations for its group of Jewish passengers. It allows Friday night prayers. There's actually a portrait of Hitler that is hanging on the boat. They have to take that down off the wall. There's all these just sort of little details that sort of paint this picture of what it must have been like to be on this journey.
When you think about this journey, this is not your typical ship. And the expectation is not clear about what awaits them. And you're on this ship for weeks. It's I can't imagine what it would be like to be on a ship from Europe all the way to the United States or to Cuba, where they eventually land, and then to have no clue about how you're going to be received, if you're going to be received. There's a lot of anxiety, to say the least.
I would imagine anxiety wrapped up with all sorts of other emotions, including, I'm sure there was a moment when people were getting on the ship that they felt some sense of relief. They had just been the target of pogroms and ethnic cleansing in Germany, and here they are finally finding a way out. And there had to have been, at least for many of them, this belief that surely someone will take us. They had saved up the money in order to purchase visas and to purchase passage, and just this hope that no doubt was there in the first part of the trip as they were headed to Cuba.
Yeah. A few other sort of nuts and bolts of the process. I mean, the reason the ship was headed for Havana was because Cuba was kind of seen as a transit point to get a visa and then come to the United States. And when the ship gets turned back there, there's sort of direct appeals to come to the U.S. and Canada. And as we said, those are rejected. There were immigration quotas at this point for German-Austrian immigrants. In 1939, the quota was 27,370 people. So, this butts up against, as we're saying, restrictive immigration policies that have existed for much of this country's history and often been related to specific groups.
Yeah, restrictive immigration policies, and also this persistent idea that, well, we have rules and the rules can't be broken. There was a State Department telegram in response to their plea for help in which they said, asylum seekers have to await their turn on the waiting list and qualify for and obtain immigration visas before they're made admissible to the United States. And that idea that, well, we'd take you, but you gotta wait in line. You gotta follow the rules.
And the captain, the ship's captain, is pleading really for 7 days, trying to get him to take these nearly 900 passengers. And Cuba refuses.
Yeah.
And there are children on this ship. I think that's important to note as well, that these are not just adults. These are families. These are people who are trying to protect the most vulnerable among them. So when the hopes are dashed, people become desperate. And, one man slits his wrist and throws himself overboard. There is wailing, weeping, crying aboard the ship. One passenger said, "If I close my eyes, I can still hear his shrieks and see the blood." This is a devastating blow to the hundreds of people who are on the ship, who still have anxiety about where they will be able to go after this, and if they're going to be returned and placed into even a dangerous space and going back to Europe.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about how history views this moment and maybe how this moment was viewed at the time, because I think there's an argument that you hear that certainly the rise of the Nazi threat was a rise over the course of years, if not decades, that it was a growing threat, that, early on, potentially people did not see the sort of real gravity of the threat. And so I think there's some version of looking at this as an early moment when maybe people who were making the decisions about whether to take these refugees didn't really know what was truly at stake. I'm curious what you make of that argument, both in the moment and that argument looking back now with hindsight.
Well, for one, Kristallnacht had happened 6 months earlier, as you say, and there had been put in place over the course of many years before an increasingly restrictive set of laws to prevent Jews from having any sort of real freedom in Nazi Germany. Now, of course, the United States had laws in many places that restricted the freedom of minorities in the U.S. From being able to do things like vote, to live in certain areas and those kinds of things. So I think there was at least somewhat an unwillingness to see Nazi Germany as necessarily something distinct. I think that does come a little bit later, even though we can look and say there's plenty of signs that people were being murdered already.
And I think that, the underlying sentiment is people were anti-Semitic. And this was not just about a fear of communism or a fear of, a takeover. People did not want Jews around them. They did not want to take them in. And there's a lot of literature and propaganda that makes this very clear that this was motivated by anti-Semitism and thoughts that, we don't want to have to take in these people, to have to deal with these people. So everyone's really pushing the buck. It's not just Cuba saying we don't want you. It's the United States, we don't want you. It's Canada saying we don't want you. And feeling as though there's no place that you can go where you would be wanted or belong is part of the story here too.
Yeah. I mean, there's the anti-Semitism that drove these refugees out of their home country. And I think we have to acknowledge the anti-Semitism that they faced when they came to this country, and it was at the heart of why they were rejected from this country. I mean, you look at in early May, there was a massive anti-Semitic demonstration in Havana. Right-wing newspapers are whipping up a fervor about European refugees. There's, just a week before this ship, or 2 weeks before this ship arrives, there's editorial in a right-wing newspaper in Cuba that talks about immigration flooding and descending upon our country, and if we continue to have open doors to European refugees, we'll soon begin to feel the consequences. They will take our jobs. And it's this kind of mishmash of rank anti-Semitism and this coded language about these immigrants are going to take our jobs and undercut our way of living.
And those are papers in Havana, but, we see that in the United States. We see that in Canada. We see that in Europe, where there were pretty strict limits on how many refugees each country would take. And so even as the acknowledgement of the crisis grows, there is a sense of, all right, this is kind of our problem, but not so much that we're going to open our doors and make sure that people have a place to which to flee. And I think that that's very clear in the responses of a lot of different countries, including the U.S., which takes forever to actually say, okay, we are going to take in significant numbers of Jewish refugees.
Yeah. Let's come back to the St. Louis a bit. As I said, it returns to Belgium, actually, eventually, June 17th. It docks in Antwerp, Belgium. By that point, Belgium, France, the Netherlands, Great Britain were starting to give visas for refugees from Germany, so a number of them enter those countries. As I said, the majority of people who were on this ship do survive, but 254 later do die as the Nazis sweep through the continent. The legacy of this, it's not for many, many years later, in the 2000s, that finally the United States and Canada just take a hard look at this incident and issue apologies.
Yeah, you do start to see apologies trickling out from the U.S. government and the Canadian government for a whole variety of things in the 1990s and 2000s. It's almost as if, enough time has passed that we can look at this, acknowledge it, and there won't necessarily be, we're at least a generation or two removed, and so we ourselves are not culpable for it. This was something that happened in the past. And I think that is, you see that in the apologies and reparations for Japanese and Japanese American people who were interned in the United States. So you start to see those kinds of apologies about this time, a kind of recognition of wrongdoing from an earlier generation.
Yeah.
You even start to see memorials that pop up to mark this moment. January of 2011, a memorial sculpture commemorating the St. Louis refugees was unveiled in the Canadian Museum of Immigration, and you can go there and see this kinetic steel sculpture that's comprised of 4 gears. The first is labeled hatred and turns increasingly towards these larger gears that are labeled racism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism. And the names of all the passengers on the ship are also etched into the sculpture. So it's a really powerful way, I think, of compelling people to look at a part of our history in which many of us chose to ignore.
And I think that becomes important in the mid-2010s when the debate about Syrian refugees begins to really build, because the story of the SS St. Louis becomes part of those arguments. Are you once again turning away people fleeing violence and certain death and saying, we can't take that many refugees? I mean, the U.S. was very slow to take Syrian refugees, and the numbers were very low, and that was true in Europe as well, in different countries. So there was this sense that, okay, we've apologized for this thing that happened in our past. It's happening again. What are we going to do? And so there was a kind of utility to that history during those debates.
Yeah, well, we see things for what they are. And even more so, I think we see so many Syrian refugees were painted and scapegoated as possible terrorists, and you see the way that Jewish refugees were scapegoated and painted as possible communist infiltrators, right?
And the same at the border. The same could be said at the Mexican border.
Right. So you see the same playbook play out over and over. That sculpture that you mentioned is in Halifax. If we have any listeners in Halifax, tell us if you've gone and see that sculpture. We'd love to hear what it's like to actually be there. Okay. That brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Abergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.